Chapter 12. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. Opium and Tobacco. Few plants can lay claim to such complex and tangled relationships to human beings as can the opium poppy and the tobacco plant. Both plants are central to extremely addictive behaviors in human beings that shorten life and burden society with medical and financial consequences. Yet the general attitude toward these plants could hardly be more different. Opium is illegal throughout most of the world. The poppy-growing areas that are the source of raw opium are closely monitored by photosurveillance satellites, and yearly advanced projections of world opium production are closely studied by governments to aid them in calculating how much of their budgets to allocate to treatment of addicts, foreign eradication efforts, and domestic interdiction of refined opium products like morphine and heroin. Tobacco, on the other hand, is probably the most widely consumed plant drug on Earth. No nation has ever decreed smoking of tobacco illegal, and indeed, any country that sought to do so would find itself at loggerheads with one of the most powerful international narcotic cartels ever to exist. Yet there is no dispute that tobacco smoking is the cause of early death for millions of people. Lung cancer, emphysema, and heart disease have all been linked to smoking. And tobacco is no less addicting than the supposed hardest of hard drugs, heroin. When this fact was stated by U.S. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, it was quickly buried in the storm of derision unleashed by the major American tobacco companies and their legions of addicted customers. Paradoxical attitudes. What can we learn from the comparison of these two plants? Both have a long history of human usage, both are addictive and ultimately destructive, and yet one is firmly integrated into our lifestyles and sold to us as masculine, sophisticated, pleasurable, while the other is illegal, furiously suppressed, inveighed against as suicidal, and viewed with an unreflecting horror that earlier generations reserved for Bolsheviks, suffragettes, and oral sex. This situation is but another example of the hypocrisy of dominator culture as it picks and chooses the truths and realities that it finds comfortable. The fact is that while heroin is highly addictive, and while one of its preferred routes of ingestion, intravenous self-injection, offers opportunities for the spread of serious disease, it is nevertheless no more dangerous than its legal and highly touted competitor, tobacco. Volumes of scientific research have concluded that no known organic damage is caused by the use of heroin. It is a physically benign, though powerfully addicting substance. The differences in the way that society views these two now globally pandemic plant-based drugs cannot be the result of a reasonable assessment of their deleterious social impacts. If it were, then attitudes toward these two plants would be similar. As it is, we must look at effects unrelated to the shared property of addiction to understand why dominator society has chosen to suppress one and exalt the other. Smoking introduced to Europe. Tobacco is native to the New World, and so is the custom of smoking plant material to obtain narcotic effects from it. Smoking may have been known in the Old World during the Neolithic period. Scholarly opinion differs. However, there is no evidence of tobacco smoking being a practice known to any of the historical civilizations of the Old World until Columbus introduced it following his second voyage to the Americas. Less than 100 years later, small packets of tobacco were being placed into the graves of Lapland shamans. This gives some notion of how quickly tobacco was able to assert its traditional pattern of usage, even in a society that was completely unfamiliar with it. Tobacco, chewed, snuffed, and smoked, has been with us ever since. By the 19th century, tobacco use had been culturally classified in Europe as a man's prerogative. Successful men were judged by the quantity and quality of cigars they smoked. And tobacco was added to the long list of male dominator privileges which included nearly all alcohol, brandies for the ladies, please, control of finance, access to prostitutes, and control of political power. Recall those smoke-filled rooms. Even in today's drug-conscious atmosphere, no contradiction is perceived between the strident calls to eliminate the use of drugs in professional athletics and the figure of the tobacco-chewing major league pitcher, eyes hardened with narcotic intensity as he strides to the mound. Does the elimination of drugs from competitive sports mean the extinction of that lovable figure, the lump-cheeked hayseed with a good pitching arm? Somehow I doubt it. As tobacco was achieving its present stature, opium, too, was enjoying a vogue, albeit nothing on the scale of tobacco. Laudanum, tincture of opium and alcohol, was being used as a cure for colic in infants, a woman's tonic, a cure for dysentery, and most significantly by writers, travelers, and other bohemian types, as a stimulant of the creative imagination. Morphine, which must be injected, was the first alkaloid to be isolated. This event in 1805 cast a dark shadow over the halcyon world of the laudanum enthusiast, for however much artistic mileage Coleridge and De Quincey obtained from their imagined enslavement to the fiend of opium, their addictions, though serious, when judged in the light of modern experience with cocaine freebase and new synthetic forms of heroin, appear almost minor. The ancient lure of opium. The seed of the poppy is a delicious and non-psychoactive food, as all enthusiasts of poppy seed rolls can attest. Yet when the seed capsule is scratched with blade or fingernail, a milky latex-like material soon accumulates, and as it hardens, turns a dark brown. This material is raw opium. Like the psilocybin mushroom with its association with cattle, and the parasitism of ergot on rye and other cereals, the opium poppy is a major psychoactive plant that has evolved in the presence of a human food source. In the case of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, the psychoactivity and the nutritional value are sectioned off into different parts of the same plant. Opium in various forms has been in the physician's armamentarium since at least 1600 BC. An Egyptian medical treatise of that period prescribed opium for crying children, just as Victorian nannies dosed infants with opiate-laced Godfrey's cordial to keep them quiet. For most of its history, opium was not smoked, but rather the black sticky resin was dissolved into wine and drunk, or else rolled into a pellet and swallowed. Opium as a cure for pain, as euphorant and rumored aphrodisiac, was known in Eurasia for several thousand years. During the waning of the millennia-long Minoan civilization and its religion of archaic worship of a great mother, the original source of the connection to the goddess of vegetable nature came eventually to be replaced by the intoxication of opium. Early Minoan texts testify to the fact that poppies were widely cultivated on both Crete and Pylos during the late Minoan. In these texts, the poppy head is used as an ideogram in financial tallies. The yield of poppies indicated is so huge that for some time it was assumed that these numbers must refer to grain rather than opium. The confusion of grain and poppy is easy to understand, as Demeter was the goddess of both. In fact, how much of the lore of the poppy was transferred to the Greek mysteries of Demeter on the mainland remains to be elucidated, especially as there is some iconographic confusion between the poppy flower and the pomegranate, also a plant associated with the mysteries. Karenyi quotes Theocritos 7:157. For the Greeks, Demeter was still a poppy goddess, bearing sheaves and poppies in both hands. A remarkable illustration in Eric Newman's The Great Mother shows the goddess in association with a beehive and holding poppy seed capsules and heads of grain in her left hand, while resting her right hand on one of the unadorned pillars to the central Minoan earth religion. Rarely have so many elements of the archaic technology of ecstasy been brought together so explicitly. The figure is almost an allegory of the transformation of Minoan shamanic spirituality in its late phase. Its mushroom roots are symbolized in the aniconic column. They are the touchstone of the goddess who looks toward the promise of poppies and ergotized grain. The hive of bees introduces the theme of honey, the archetypal image of ecstasy, female sexuality, and preservation that survives the shifting botanical identities of the sacraments. Poppies and gum opium were known to the ancient Egyptians and appear in their funeral arts as well as in the earliest medical papyruses. Poppies were known in several varieties to the Persians. In ancient Greece and elsewhere, the poppy was known as the destroyer of grief. Theophrastus knew of it as a sleep-inducing drug in 300 BC, and his observations were repeated by Pliny in the 1st century AD with added thoughts on opium poisoning. The Greeks consecrated the poppy to Nyx, goddess of night, Morpheus, son of Hypnos and god of dreams, and Thanatos, god of death. They summarized all of its properties and the deities to whom it was offered. Opium spread throughout the Islamic world after the 7th century. It was undoubtedly used both as a dysentery cure and for those overburdened with grief and care. Although opium's habit-forming quality was mentioned by Heraclides of Tarentum in the 3rd century BC, this was something even physicians were generally unaware of until nearly 2,000 years later. We who have been raised with the notion of addiction as disease may find it hard to believe that chemical dependency upon opiates was not noted or described by medical authorities until early in the 17th century. Samuel Purchas, writing in 1613, observed of opium that, But being once used, it must daily be continued on pain of death, though some escape by taking to wine instead. Alethea Hayter comments that this awareness that opium is addictive is rarely found so early. For the ancient world, then, opium was that which brought sleep and relief from pain. Opium was prescribed and perhaps overprescribed during the final days of the Roman Empire. Then the use of opium nearly ceased for many centuries in Europe. The early herbals of Saxon England mentioned juice expelled from poppies as a cure for headache and sleeplessness, but clearly opium played a very minor role in the armamentarium of medieval Europe. Martin Ruhlen's Alchemical Lexicon, published in 1612, mentions only the word osoror as a synonym for opium, and then without explanation. Alchemical opium. It is to Paracelsus, the famed father of chemotherapy, that we can trace the revival of interest in opium. The great 16th-century Swiss alchemist, medical reformer, and quack advocated and used opium on a lavish scale. Here again, as in the case of distilled alcohol, it is an alchemist, one involved in the pursuit of the spirit assumed to be locked into matter, who discovered the means to release the power locked within a simple plant. And, like Lully before him, Paracelsus assumed that he had discovered the universal panacea. I possess a secret remedy which I call laudanum, and which is superior to all other heroic remedies. Shortly after Paracelsus began promulgating the virtues of opium, physicians of his school of thought were preparing nostrums whose sole basis of activity was the copious amount of opium that they contained. One of these enthusiastic followers, the alchemist Van Helmont, became well known as Dr. Opiates, the first croaker or junk doctor. Tobacco Redux. While the iatrochemists of the Paracelsian persuasion were spreading the use of opium in Europe, an exotic newcomer was quietly making its way onto the European stage. Tobacco was the first and most immediate payoff of the discovery of the New World. On November 2, 1492, less than a month after his first arrival in the New World, Columbus landed on the north coast of Cuba. There, the admiral of the Ocean Sea dispatched 2 gift-laden members of his crew to the interior of the island, where he believed that the king of the many coastal villages he had seen must reside. Doubtless, there was still some hope in the admiral's mind that his men would return with word of gold, precious stones, fine woods, and spices, the wealth of the Indies. Instead, the scouts returned with an account of men and women who partially inserted burning rolls of leaves into their nostrils. These burning rolls were called tobaccos and consisted of dry herbs wrapped up in a large dry leaf. They were lit at one end, and the people sucked at the other and drank the smoke, or inhaled, something that was utterly unknown in Europe. De las Casas, the bishop of Chiapas, who published the account of Columbus's in which this description occurs, added this observation: I know of Spaniards who imitate this custom, and when I reprimand the savage practice, they answered that it was not in their power to refrain from indulging in the habit. Although the Spaniards were extremely surprised by this peculiar custom, on experimenting with it themselves, they soon obtained such pleasure that they began to imitate the savage example. 4 years after the first voyage, the hermit Romano Pani, whom Columbus had left in Haiti at the conclusion of the second voyage to the New World, described in his journal the native habit of inhaling the tobacco fumes with the help of a bird bone instrument inserted into the nose and held over tobacco strewn on a bed of coals. The consequences of this simple ethnograph observation have still to be calculated. It introduced into Europe an extremely efficient method for conveying drugs, including many potentially dangerous drugs, into the human body. It made possible the worldwide pandemic of tobacco smoking. It was a fast-acting and easily abused route of administering both opium and hashish, and it was the distant ancestor of the crack cocaine and PCP smoker. It also, it must be said, makes possible the most profound of the indole hallucinogen-induced ecstasies, the rarely encountered but incomparable practice of smoking dimethyltryptamine. Shamanic tobaccos. Tobacco smoking was widespread in North America at the time of the European contact. While the habit of taking hallucinogenic DMT-containing snuffs was also prevalent in the Caribbean cultural area, there are no confirmed reports of materials other than tobacco being smoked. The high culture of the Maya that flourished until the mid-800s in Mesoamerica had an old and complex relationship with tobacco and the habit of smoking it. The tobacco of the classical Maya was Nicotiana rustica, which is still in use among aboriginal populations in South America today. This species is much more potent, chemically complex, and potentially hallucinogenic than the commercial grades of Nicotiana tabacum available today. The difference between this tobacco and cigarette tobacco is profound. This wild tobacco was cured and rolled into cigars which were smoked. The trance-like state that followed, partially synergized by the presence of compounds that included MAO inhibitors, was central to the shamanism of the Maya. Recently introduced antidepressants of the MAO inhibitor type are distant synthetic relatives of these natural compounds. Francis Robišek has published extensively on the Mayan fascination with tobacco and its chemical complexity. It also must be recognized that nicotine is by no means the only bioactive substance in the tobacco leaf. Recently, alkaloids of the Harmala group, Harman and non-Harman, have been isolated from cured commercial tobaccos and their smoke. They constitute a chemical group of beta-carbolines, which include harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, and 6-methoxyharmine, all with hallucinogenic properties. While to date no native varieties of tobacco have been analyzed for these substances, it is a reasonable supposition that their composition may vary widely, depending upon the variety and growth, and that some of the native-grown tobaccos may contain a relatively high concentration of them. Tobacco was and is the ever-present adjunct of the more powerful and visionary hallucinogenic plants wherever in the Americas they are used in a traditional and shamanic way. And one of the traditional uses of tobacco involved the New World's invention of the first enemas. Peter first had researched the role of enemas and clysters in Mesoamerican medicine and shamanism. It has only recently come to light that the ancient Maya, like the ancient Peruvians, employed enemas. Enema syringes or narcotic clysters, and even enema rituals, were discovered to be represented in Maya art, an outstanding example being a large painted vase dating AD 600 to 800, on which a man is depicted carrying an enema syringe, applying an enema to himself, and having a woman apply it to him. As a result of this newly discovered scene, archaeologist M.D. Coe was able to identify a curious object held by a jaguar deity on another painted Maya vessel as an enema syringe. If the enemas of the ancient Maya were, like those of the Peruvian Indians, intoxicating or hallucinogenic, they might have consisted of fermented balche, honey mead. B&W is a very sacred beverage, and it may have been fortified with tobacco or with morning glory seed infusions. Datura infusions and even hallucinogenic mushrooms may have been taken in this way. Of course, they could also have used a tobacco infusion alone. Tobacco as quack medicine. Any drug introduced into use inevitably winds up associated with a number of quack medical theories and treatments. Cocaine abuse, as we shall see, was preceded by the craze for the tonic Vinde Mariani, and heroin was touted as a cure for morphine addiction. Lest we recoil from the enema rituals of the Maya, consider that in 1661, the Danish physician Thomas Bartholin recommended not only tobacco juice enemas, but also tobacco smoke enemas to his patients. Those who have swallowed tobacco by accident can testify to its purgative effect. This property is employed in the tobacco clyster used as an enema. My beloved brother Erasmus has shown me the method. Smoke from 2 pipes filled with tobacco is blown into the intestines. A suitable instrument for this was devised by the ingenious English. Not to be outdone by the clever English, an 18th-century French physician named Bouchoz advocated the use of intravaginal insufflation of tobacco smoke to cure hysteria. Quite aside from these eccentric and bizarre applications of the use of tobacco, and despite the scorn of the clergy, the habit of smoking spread quickly in Europe. Every drug, during the process of its introduction into a new cultural milieu, is hailed as a love drug, this apparently being the most effective of all advertising ploys. Drugs as diverse as heroin and cocaine, LSD and MDMA were all at some point presented as promoting intimacy, sexual or psychological. Tobacco was no different. Part of the reason for its rapid spread was widely circulated sailors' yarns of its remarkable properties as an aphrodisiac. Sailors told of the women of Nicaragua who smoked this weed and displayed an ardor undreamed of. It was probably this rumor that clinched the popularity of smoking among the women of Europe. Perhaps this is the reason why an ex-Franciscan monk, André Thevet, experienced such success in introducing tobacco to the French court in 1579. Thevet fully intended that tobacco be smoked and used as a recreational drug. Earlier, the French ambassador to Portugal, Jean Nicot, had experimented with crushed tobacco leaves used as a snuff for the purpose of curing migraine headache. In 1560, Nicot conveyed a sample of his snuff to Catherine de' Medici, who was a chronic migraine sufferer. The queen was enthusiastic about the plant's powers, and it briefly became known as Herba Medicea, or Herba Catherinea. Nicot's snuff was derived from the generally more toxic Nicotiana rustica, the classic shamanic tobacco of the Maya. The vase Nicotiana tabacum conquered Europe in the form of the cigarette, and was the plant that became the basis for the tremendously important tobacco economy that grew up in the colonial New World. Contra tobacco. Tobacco was not welcomed by all. Pope Urban VIII ordered excommunication for anyone who smoked or used snuff in the churches of Spain. In 1650, Innocent X forbade snuff-taking in the Basilica of St. Peter on pain of excommunication. Protestants also decried the new habit and were led in their effort by no less than King James I of England, whose inflammatory Counterblast to Tobacco appeared in 1604. And now, good countrymen, let us, I pray you, consider what honor or policy can move us to imitate the Slavish Indians, especially in so vile and stinking custom. I say without blushing, why do we abase ourselves so far as to imitate these beastly Indians, slaves to the Spaniards, refuse to the world, and as yet aliens to the holy covenant of God? Why do we not as well imitate them in walking naked as they do? Yes, why do we not deny God and adore the devil as they do? Having unleashed this rhetorical counterblast, in what may be seen as the first unlimbering of the just say no approach, the king turned his attention to other matters. 8 years later, a report claimed that in the city of London alone, there were no fewer than 7,000 tobacconists and tobacco houses. Tobacco smoking and snuff-taking were pursued at the level of intensity of a modern craze. Tobacco triumphant. In commercial terms, tobacco did not attain major importance until after the close of the 30 Years' War in 1648. By then, American colonies were in place and well able to participate in the mercantile economy that had been established. In fact, this economy ran in large part on the tobacco of the North American colonies and the distilled alcohol and raw sugar of the more tropical outposts. The Age of Enlightenment was firmly founded on a drug-based economy. A remarkable process attended the introduction of tobacco into Europe. Because of the emphasis on the recreational potential and the large-scale planting of Nicotiana tabacum, the less toxic of the two major species, tobacco lost its connotation as a plant of shamanic and even hallucinogenic power. This was more than a matter of shifts in the standard dose and the method of administration. The native tobaccos that I have experienced among Amazonian peoples were extremely disorienting and barely subtoxic. They were definitely capable of producing an altered state of consciousness. The tobacco-using habit as it evolved in Europe was secular and recreational, and hence much more mild strains of tobacco were commercially successful. Once a drug is discovered, it often goes through a process of dilution before a general consensus is reached on the most desirable level of effect. Moving from eating opium or hashish to smoking of these substances was such a process, as was the move from large doses of LSD in the 1960s to the current practice of taking small doses of LSD for recreational reasons. This latter move may have been the consequence of the small but persistent percentage of people who suffered severe psychotic breaks after using large doses of LSD. The notion of the correct dose of a drug is something that a culture evolves over time. There are, of course, some counterexamples as well. The trend from snuffing powdered cocaine to smoking crack cocaine exemplifies a movement toward larger doses and more dangerous use patterns. The Opium Wars. It was the prohibition of tobacco smoking in China by the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty, 1628 to 1644, that led frustrated tobacco addicts to experiment with smoking opium. Before that time, the smoking of opium was not known. Thus it is that the suppression of one drug seems inevitably to lead to involvement with another. By 1793, opium and tobacco were being routinely smoked together throughout China. Beginning in 1729, the Chinese had strictly prohibited the importation and sale of opium. In spite of this, opium imports, brought by the Portuguese from plantations in Goa, continued to rise, until by 1830, more than 25,000 chests of opium were being illegally imported into China. English financial interests that felt threatened by the prohibitions manipulated the situation into the so-called Opium Wars of 1838 to 1842. The East India Company and the British government rationalized the opium trade with a kind of bland hypocrisy which has made the English establishment a byword for 3 centuries. There was no direct connection between the opium trade and the East India Company, which of course had a monopoly position in the British tea trade, until 1834. The opium was sold at auction in Calcutta. After this, the company abjured all responsibility for the drug. The incident that triggered this episode of capitalistic terrorism and true drug enslavement on a mass scale was the destruction of 20,000 chests of opium by Chinese authorities. In 1838, the Emperor Tao Kuang sent an official emissary named Lin to Canton to end the illegal trade in opium. Official orders were issued to the British and Chinese drug dealers to remove their goods, but the orders were ignored. Commissioner Lin then burned the Chinese warehouses on land and the British ships awaiting unloading in the harbor. More than a year's supply of opium was sent up in smoke. Chroniclers who witnessed the event recalled that the aroma was incomparable. The controversy dragged on, but eventually in 1840, war was declared. The British took the initiative, secure in the power and preeminence of the Royal Navy. The Chinese did not have a chance. The war was short and decisive. In 1840, Chusan was captured, and the following year the British bombarded and destroyed forts on the Canton River. The local Chinese commander, Qi Shen, who had succeeded Commissioner Lin, agreed to cede Hong Kong and pay an indemnity of 6 million Chinese silver dollars, worth about 300,000 pounds. When the news reached Peking, the emperor was left with no course but to agree. Thus the Chinese suffered considerable losses in money and territory. 15 years later, a second war broke out. This war, too, ended unsuccessfully for China. Shortly afterward, the Treaty of Tientsin legalized the Chinese opium traffic. In many ways, this incident was to be the model for much larger forays into international drug trading on the part of 20th century governments. It showed clearly that the potential marketability of new drugs can and will overwhelm institutional forces that oppose or appear to oppose the new commodity. The pattern established by England's 19th century opium diplomacy has been repeated, albeit with some new wrinkles, in Central Intelligence Agency collusion in the international heroin and cocaine trade of our own time. Opium and cultural style. De Quincey. In the early 19th century, opium was influencing more than the Far Eastern policy of the mercantile empires. It was also having an unexpected influence on the aesthetic forms and styles of European thought. In a sense, European society was awakening from narcissistic preoccupation with Renaissance classicism and finding itself a spectator at the seductively metaphysical and aesthetically exotic banquet being conducted by the Grand Turk of the Ottomans, a banquet whose major aperitif was the opium vision. There is no way to avoid a discussion of Thomas de Quincey at this point. Like Timothy Leary in the 1960s, de Quincey was able to convey the visionary power of what he experienced. For de Quincey, this was a power imprisoned within the labyrinth of the poppy. He was able to convey the opium vision with the force and the filigree of melancholia typical of Romanticism. Almost single-handedly, he created in his Confessions of an English Opium Eater the cultural image, the zeitgeist of the experience of opium intoxication and a metaphysic of opium. He invented the form of the drug confession, the primary genre of subsequent drug literature. His descriptions of the worldview of the opium user are unsurpassed. Many years ago, when I was looking over Piranesi's Antiquities of Rome, Mr. Coleridge, who was standing by, described to me a set of plates by that artist, called His Dreams, and which record the scenery of his own visions during the delirium of a fever. Some of them, I describe only from memory of Mr. Coleridge's account, represented vast Gothic halls, on the floor of which stood all sorts of engines and machinery, wheels, cables, pulleys, levers, catapults, etc., expressive of enormous power put forth, and resistance overcome. Creeping along the sides of the wall, you perceived a staircase, and upon it, groping his way upward, was Piranesi himself. Follow the stairs a little farther, and you perceive it to come to a sudden abrupt termination, without any balustrade, and allowing no step onward to him who had reached the extremity, except into the depths below. Whatever is to become of poor Piranesi, you suppose at least that his labors must in some way terminate here. But raise your eyes, and behold a second flight of stairs still higher, on which again Piranesi is perceived, but this time standing on the very brink of the abyss. Again elevate your eyes, and a still more aerial flight of stairs is beheld, and again is poor Piranesi busy on his aspiring labors. And so on until the unfinished stairs and Piranesi both are lost in the upper gloom of the hall. With the same power of endless growth and self-reproduction did my architecture proceed in dreams. Opium exhilarates the spirit. It can produce endlessly unraveling streamers of thought and rhapsodic speculation. The 50 years following De Quincey's Confessions were to see a deep grappling with the impact of opium use on creativity, especially literary creativity. De Quincey pioneered this effort. He was the first writer to study deliberately, from within his personal experience, the way in which dreams and visions are formed, how opium helps to form them and intensifies them, and how they are then recomposed and used in conscious art, in his case in impassioned prose. But the process would also apply to poetry. He learned his waking technique as a writer partly from observation of how the mind works in dreams and reveries under the influence of opium. It was his belief that opium dreams and reveries could be in themselves a creative process both analogous to and leading to literary creation. He used dreams in his writing not as a decoration, not as allegory, not as a device to create atmosphere or to forestall and help on the plot, not even as intimations of a higher reality, although he believed that they were that, but as a form of art in themselves. His study of the workings of the imagination in sleep to produce dreams was pursued with as much concentration as some of his contemporaries devoted to the working of the waking imagination to produce poetry. The beginning of psychopharmacology. The analytical and psychological interests of men like De Quincey and the French psychiatrist J.J. Moreau de Tours, and their attitudes toward the substances that they sought to explore, signify the beginnings of the less than happy effort of science to come to terms with these materials. Implicit in their work is the assumption that intoxication can mimic madness, a strong hint that madness, the most mental of maladies, was rooted in physical causes. The opium dream was seen as a kind of waking theater of the imagination, and there is in the fascination with dreams an anticipation of the psychoanalytical methods of Freud and Jung. This fascination is felt throughout the literature of the 19th century, in Goethe, in Baudelaire, in Mallarmé, Huysmans, and Heine. It is the siren song of the unconscious, silent since the destruction of Eleusis, but expressed in Romanticism and the Pre-Raphaelites as a pagan exuberance, driven as often as not by devotion to opium. The heavy-lidded harlots of a Beardsley Seraglio, or the darker labyrinthine visions of Odilon Redon, or Dante Gabriel Rossetti, epitomize this aesthetic. As the aesthetic had a darker side, so too the chemistry of the poppy began to yield more consuming and more virulently addictive derivatives. The hypodermic syringe was discovered in 1853, and from then on the users of opiates have had the cautionary example of the severely addicted intravenous user of morphine to temper their devotion. The 19th century experienced a sorting out of the bewildering variety of new drugs and stimulants that the previous 2 centuries of exploration and exploitation of far-flung lands had brought. Tobacco use in its various forms became widespread in all social classes, especially among men. Opium was abused by smaller but nonetheless vast numbers of persons, also drawn from all classes. Distilled alcohol was produced and abused in far larger quantities than ever before. In this environment, temperance organizations also emerged, and the modern positions vis-à-vis the drug question began to develop. Yet the true impact of the spreading habits of synthetic drug abuse still lay ahead in the 20th century. Chapter 13. Synthetics: Heroin, Cocaine, and Television. Morphine was isolated in 1805 by the young German chemist Friedrich Serturner. For Serturner, morphine was the purest essence of the poppy plant. He named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It was this success in isolating the essence of the opium poppy that inspired chemists to attempt the isolation of pure compounds from other proven materia medica. Drugs for the relief of heart disease were isolated from foxglove. Quinine was extracted from the cinchona tree, purified and used in the colonial conquest of the malarial zone, and from the leaves of a South American bush was extracted a new and promising local anesthetic, cocaine. Morphine use was restricted and sporadic until after the middle of the 19th century. At first, its major non-medical use was as a vehicle of suicide, but this phase was brief, and soon morphine was established as a new and very different sort of drug. In 1853, Alexander Wood invented the hypodermic syringe. Before its invention, physicians had used the hollow stems of the lilac plant to introduce drugs inside the body. The syringe arrived just in time to be used to inject morphine into soldiers wounded in the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. This established a pattern that we will meet again in the history of opiates, the pattern of war as vector of addiction. By 1890, use of morphine on the battlefield had resulted in significant addict populations in both Europe and the United States. So many Civil War veterans returned home as addicts to injectable morphine that yellow journalists referred to morphine addiction as the soldier's disease. Hard narcotics. Distilled alcohol and white sugar had preceded morphine as examples of high-purity addictive compounds, but morphine set the pattern for the modern hard drugs, meaning highly addictive injectable narcotics. At first, such drugs were derived from opiates, but all too soon cocaine joined the list. Once heroin, invented as a cure for morphine addiction, was introduced, it quickly replaced morphine as the synthetic opiate of choice among addicts. Heroin has retained this position throughout the 20th century. Heroin also quickly replaced all other drugs in the public fantasy concerning the evils of drug addiction. Even to this day, with statistics showing that alcohol kills 10 times more often than heroin addiction is still viewed as the depths of drug depravity. There are 2 reasons for this view. One reason is the actual addictive power of heroin. The craving for heroin and the illegal or violent acts that the craving may induce have given heroin the reputation as a drug whose addicts will kill for it. Tobacco addicts might kill for their fix too if they had to, but instead they simply walk out to a 7-Eleven to buy cigarettes. The other reason for the distaste with which heroin addiction is viewed is the characteristics of the intoxicated state. Immediately after his shot, the heroin addict is cheerful, almost ebullient. This active response to the shot quickly gives way to the nod or nodding out. The junkie's goal with each shot of junk is to get the nod on, to get into the detached state of twilight sleep in which the long reveries of the opiates can unfurl themselves. In this state, there is no pain, no regret, no distraction, and no fear. Heroin is the perfect drug for anyone who has been damaged by lack of self-esteem or traumatized by historical upheaval. It is a drug of battlefields, concentration camps, cancer wards, prisons, and ghettos. It is the drug of the resigned and the dissolute, the surely dying and the victims unwilling or unable to fight back. Junk is the ideal product, the ultimate merchandise. No sales talk necessary. The client will crawl through a sewer and beg to buy. The junk merchant does not sell his product to the consumer, he sells the consumer to his product. He does not improve or simplify his merchandise. He degrades and simplifies the client. He pays his staff in junk. Junk yields a basic formula of evil virus, the algebra of need. The face of evil is always the face of total need. A dope fiend is a man in total need of dope. Beyond a certain frequency, need knows absolutely no limit or control. In the words of Total Need, wouldn't you? Yes, you would. You would lie, cheat, inform on your friends, steal, do anything to satisfy total need. Because you would be in a state of total sickness, total possession, and not in a position to act in any other way. Dope fiends are sick people who cannot act other than they do. A rabid dog cannot choose but bite. Cocaine, the horror of the whiteness. Like heroin, cocaine is a modern high-purity drug derived from a plant with a long history of folk use. For millennia, the peoples of the montane rainforests of South America have held cultural values that promote the ritual and religious use of the stimulant food coca. Locals in areas where coca has traditionally been cultivated and used will immediately tell one, "Coca no es un droga, es comida." Coca is not a drug, it is food. And indeed, this appears to be largely the case. The self-administered doses of ground coca dust contain a significant percentage of the daily requirement of vitamins and minerals. Coca also is a powerful appetite suppressant. The importance of these facts cannot be appreciated without an understanding of the situation regarding protein availability in the Amazonian forest and Andean Altipano. The casual traveler might suppose that the lushness of the tropical forest signifies an abundance of fruits, edible seeds, and roots. This is not the case. Competition for available protein resources is so fierce among the thousands of species of life that comprise the jungle biota that nearly all usable organic materials are actually bound in living systems. Human penetration into such an environment is greatly aided by an appetite-suppressing plant. Of course, appetite suppression is only one characteristic of coca use. The important characteristic is stimulation. The climaxed rainforest is a difficult place to inhabit. Gathering food and building shelter often requires carrying large amounts of material over considerable distances. Often the machete is the only tool to hold the rainforest at bay. To the ancient Inca culture of Peru, and later to the indigenous people and the mestizo colonistas, coca was a goddess, a kind of New World echo of Graves' white goddess Leucothea. Significantly, the goddess Mama Coca, as a young girl offering the saving branch of coca to the Spanish conqueror, figures prominently in the frontispiece of W. Golden Mortimer's classic History of Coca, the divine plant of the Incas. In 1859, cocaine was isolated for the first time. Pharmacology was undergoing a kind of renaissance, and research with cocaine was vigorously pursued over the next several decades. At this point in our discussion, it seems hardly necessary to mention that cocaine was first hailed as an obvious cure for morphinism. Medical researchers who were attracted to the new drug included the young Sigmund Freud. At present, it is impossible to assess with any certainty to what extent coca can be expected to increase human mental powers. I have the impression that protracted use of coca can lead to a lasting improvement if the inhibitions manifested before it is taken are due only to physical causes or to exhaustion. To be sure, the instantaneous effect of a dose of coca cannot be compared with that of a morphine injection, but on the good side of the ledger there is no danger of general damage to the body, as is the case with the chronic use of morphine. Freud's findings, which he would later repudiate, were neither very widely publicized nor well received where they were noticed. It was a fellow student of Freud's in Vienna, Karl Kohler, who took the next step in the medical application of cocaine, the discovery of its use as a local anesthetic. Overnight, Kohler's discovery revolutionized surgery. By 1885, cocaine was being hailed as a tremendous medical breakthrough. However, as its use spread, its action as an addiction-inducing stimulant was also noted. Cocaine was the inspiration for the unnamed drug that causes sudden personality change in Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a fact that contributed to its fast-accruing reputation as a virulent new vice of the wealthy and depraved. Pro-cocaine. Not all literary references to cocaine portrayed it in such a horrific light. In 1888, British physician Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a now famous short novel, The Sign of Four, in which his detective, the redoubtable Sherlock Holmes, comments on his use of cocaine. I suppose that its influence is physically a bad one. I find it, however, so transcendingly stimulating and clarifying to the mind that its secondary action is a matter of small amount. Coca followed the pattern already set with coffee, tea, and chocolate. That is, it quickly attracted entrepreneurial attention. Chief among those who saw commercial opportunities in coca was a Frenchman, Monsieur Angelo Mariani. In 1888, the first bottle of Vin Mariani was marketed, and soon there was an entire line of coca-based and laced wines, tonics, and elixirs. Mariani was the greatest exponent of the virtues of coca the world has ever known. He steeped himself in coca lore, surrounded himself with Incan artifacts, cultivated a coca garden at his home, and directed a merchandising empire that featured his tonic wine. Through his genius for advertising, he came closer to turning on the world than any man who ever lived. Queen Victoria, Pope Leo XIII, Sarah Bernhardt, Thomas Edison, and hundreds of other celebrities and medical men gave public testimony to the tonic properties of his products in a series of 12 volumes published by his company. Modern anti-drug hysteria. In the United States at the turn of the century, racist rumor-mongering fanned the hysterical fear that Southern blacks, maddened by cocaine, might attack whites. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed. It made cocaine and heroin illegal and set the stage for the legally sanctioned suppression of the synthetic and addictive compounds found in the opium poppy and the coca bush. In contrast to tobacco, tea, and coffee, which were initially resisted and then made legal, Morphine, heroin, and cocaine began their career in modern society as legal substances, but once recognized as addictive, were suppressed. Why these drugs and not others? Was the addiction more virulent? Was the use of the hypodermic injection somehow offensive? Or was there some difference in the social and psychological effect of these drugs that made them scapegoats for the damage being done to society by alcohol and tobacco? These are difficult questions, not amenable to easy answers. Yet, if we are to understand the different climate of drug markets and drug use in the 20th century, these are the questions we must attempt to answer. Part of the answer may lie in the fact that by the beginning of the 20th century, nearly 100 years of experience with the social consequences of addictive synthetic drugs was behind us. The cheerful folly of hailing each new pharmacological discovery as a universal panacea had been amply demonstrated. What could be ignored or left undocumented in the 18th or even 19th century could not be so easily hidden in the 20th. Ever more rapid communication and transportation networks spread information about the drugs as well as the drugs themselves. These technologies helped lead to efficiently organized and administered large-scale criminal syndicates. Yet the rise of these syndicates and of modern narcotics production and distribution systems also required connivance on the part of governments. Hard drug addiction had given the drug trade a blackened reputation. Governments that had dealt drugs with impunity for centuries suddenly found themselves, in the new atmosphere of temperance and social reform, forced to legislate this lucrative trade out of the realm of ordinary commerce and into the status of an illicit activity. Governments would now make their drug money in kickback schemes and in situations in which they would be paid to look the other way. Drugs and governments. Government involvement in and direct responsibility for the drug trade would diminish, with protection rackets replacing direct earnings, while retail prices would rise astronomically. The new price structure made the drug money pie large enough for all parties to profit handsomely, governments and criminal syndicates alike. In effect, the modern solution has been for the drug cartels to operate as proxies for national governments in the matter of supplying addictive narcotics. Governments can no longer participate openly in the world narcotic trade and claim legitimacy. Only pariah governments operate without fronts. Legitimate governments prefer to have their intelligence agencies cut secret deals with the drug mafiosi, while the visible machinery of diplomacy seems all aflutter over the drug problem, a problem always presented in such terms as to convince any reasonable person of its utter insolubility. It is significant that the major production areas of hard narcotics are tribal zones. Modern imperialists would have us believe that, try as they might, they have never been able to overrun and control these areas, in Pakistan and Burma, for example, where major production of opium occurs. Consequently, faceless tribal leaders, ever-changing and with unpronounceable names, can be held responsible for it all. From 1914 until World War II, drug distribution was largely in the same hands of the gangsters who directed other illicit operations that characterize gangster subculture: prostitution, loan sharking, and various rackets. The prohibition of alcohol in the United States had created a vast windfall market for hard narcotics, as well as offering the opportunity for easy profits from alcohol manufactured illegally and sold untaxed. Government manipulation of drug markets occurred elsewhere too. During World War II, the Japanese occupiers of Manchuria took a page from the book of British colonial oppression of a century earlier and produced vast amounts of opium and heroin for distribution inside China. This was done not with an eye to profit, as in the British case, but with the intent of creating so many addicts that the will of the Chinese people to resist the occupation effectively would be broken. Later, during the 1960s, the Central Intelligence Agency would use the same technique to smother political dissent in American black ghettos under an avalanche of No. 4 China White, heroin of extraordinary purity. Drugs and international intelligence. The virulence of addictions to synthetics like heroin and cocaine could not long escape the attention of the inheritors of the slave trade and the opium wars, international intelligence agencies, and secret police organizations. These shadowy groups have an insatiable need for untraceable money to fund the private armies, terrorist cells, coup d'etat, and front groups that are their stock in trade. Involvement in and indeed domination of the world narcotics trade has proven irresistible to groups such as the CIA, Opus Dei, and the French Secret Service. The U.S. government's mafia and narcotics connection goes back, as is well known, to World War II. Two controversial joint operations between OSS, Office of Strategic Services, and ONI, U.S. Naval Intelligence, established contacts via Lucky Luciano with the Sicilian Mafia and via Tai Li with the dope-dealing Green Gang of Tu Yue Sheng in Shanghai. Both connections were extended into the post-war period. The involvement of legitimate institutions remains the same with certain exceptions. In the late 1970s, there was a move in American hard drug culture from emphasis on heroin to emphasis on cocaine. This move was in part a logical consequence of the American military defeat in Vietnam and retraction from Southeast Asia. It was soon reinforced when the Reagan agenda of Contra support and narco-terrorism opened new frontiers for covert operations. Yet it is unlikely that the virulence or social cost of the cocaine epidemic was ever anticipated. Perhaps no one ever asked the question, what are the consequences of hooking the American public on cocaine? Perhaps the development of smokable, more efficient, and more addictive crack cocaine was unexpected. It is highly likely that the phenomenon of crack is an instance of technology having escaped from the control of its creators. In the 1980s, cocaine assumed a form more virulent than any of its earlier victims and detractors could have possibly imagined. This is a new and disturbing pattern in the evolution of human drug interactions, a pattern that cannot be ignored. If today we are confronted by a super-addictive form of cocaine, why not tomorrow a super-addictive form of heroin? In fact, such forms of heroin already exist. Fortunately, they are simply not as easy to manufacture as is crack cocaine. Ice, a smokable form of highly addictive methamphetamine, has appeared in the drug underground. There will be other drugs in the future, more addictive, more destructive than anything now possible. How then will law and society respond to this phenomenon? It is to be hoped the response won't be one of self-righteously holding the addicts up as examples of contemptible behavior. From a historical point of view, restricting the availability of addictive substances must be seen as a peculiarly perverse example of Calvinist dominator thought, a system in which the sinner is to be punished in this world by being transformed into an exploitable, hapless customer who is punished for addiction by being relieved of his cash by the criminal governmental combine that provides the addictive substances. The image is more horrifying than that of the serpent that devours itself. It is once again the Dionysian image of the mother who devours her children, the image of a house divided against itself. Electronic drugs. In his science fiction novel, The Man in the High Castle, Philip K. Dick imagined an alternative world in which World War II had been won by the Japanese and the Third Reich. In Dick's fictional world, the Japanese occupation authorities introduced and legalized marijuana as one of their first moves at pacifying the population of California. Things are hardly less strange here in what conventional wisdom lightheartedly refers to as reality. In this world, too, the victors introduced an all-pervasive, ultra-powerful society-shaping drug. This drug was the first of a growing group of high-technology drugs that deliver the user into an alternative reality by acting directly on the user's sensorium, without chemicals being introduced into the nervous system. It was television. No epidemic or addictive craze or religious hysteria has ever moved faster or made as many converts in so short a time. The nearest analogy to the addictive power of television and the transformation of values that is wrought in the life of the heavy user is probably heroin. Heroin flattens the image. With heroin, things are neither hot nor cold. The junkie looks out at the world certain that whatever it is, it does not matter. The illusion of knowing and of control that heroin engenders is analogous to the unconscious assumption of the television consumer that what is seen is real somewhere in the world. In fact, what is seen are the cosmetically enhanced surfaces of products. Television, while chemically non-invasive, nevertheless is every bit as addicting and physiologically damaging as any other drug. Not unlike drugs or alcohol, the television experience allows the participant to blot out the real world and enter into a pleasurable and passive mental state. The worries and anxieties of reality are as effectively deferred by becoming absorbed in a television program as by going on a trip induced by drugs or alcohol. And just as alcoholics are only vaguely aware of their addiction, feeling that they control their drinking more than they really do, people similarly overestimate their control over television watching. Finally, it is the adverse effect of television viewing on the lives of so many people that defines it as a serious addiction. The television habit distorts the sense of time. It renders other experiences vague and curiously unreal when taking on a greater reality for itself. It weakens relationships by reducing and sometimes eliminating normal opportunities for talking, for communicating. The hidden persuader. Most unsettling of all is this. The content of television is not a vision, but a manufactured data stream that can be sanitized to protect or impose cultural values. Thus, we are confronted with an addictive and all-pervasive drug that delivers an experience whose message is whatever those who deal the drug wish it to be. Could anything provide a more fertile ground for fostering fascism and totalitarianism than this? In the United States, there are many more televisions than households. The average television set is on 6 hours a day, and the average person watches more than 5 hours a day, nearly one-third their waking time. Aware as we all are of these simple facts, we seem unable to react to their implications. Serious study of the effects of television on health and culture has only begun recently. Yet no drug in history has so quickly or completely isolated the entire culture of its users from contact with reality. And no drug in history has so completely succeeded in remaking in its own image the values of the culture that it has infected. Television is by nature the dominator drug par excellence. Control of content, uniformity of content, repeatability of content make it inevitably a tool of coercion, brainwashing, and manipulation. Television induces a trance state in the viewer that is the necessary precondition for brainwashing. As with all other drugs and technologies, television's basic character cannot be changed. Television is no more reformable than is the technology that produces automatic assault rifles. Television came along at precisely the right time from the point of view of the dominator elite. The nearly 150 years of synthetic drug epidemics that began in 1806 had led to disgust at the spectacle of human degradation and spiritual cannibalism that institutional marketing of drugs created. In the same way that slavery eventually, when no longer convenient, became odious in the eyes of the very institutions that had created it, the abuse of drugs eventually triggered a backlash against this particular form of piratical capitalism. Our drugs were made illegal. Of course, underground markets then flourished, but drugs as stated instruments of national policy had been discredited. There would continue to be opium wars, instances of governments coercing other governments and peoples to produce or buy drugs, but in the future, these wars would be dirty and secret. They would be covert. But as the intelligence agencies that arose in the wake of World War II moved to take up their deep cover positions as the masterminds of the international narcotics cartels, the popular mind was turning on to television. Flattening, editing, and simplifying, television did its job and created a post-war American culture of the Ken and Barbie variety. The children of Ken and Barbie briefly broke out of the television intoxication in the mid-60s through the use of hallucinogens. Oops, responded the dominators, and they quickly made psychedelics illegal and halted all research. A double dose of TV therapy plus cocaine was ordered up for the errant hippies, and they were quickly cured and turned into consumption-oriented yuppies. Only a recalcitrant few escaped this leveling of values. Nearly everyone learned to love Big Brother. And these few who don't are still clucked over by the dominator culture each time it compulsively scratches in the barnyard dust of its puzzlement over what happened in the 60s.